back to In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. Hope you had yourself a fantastic weekend. I know I did. Thank you for asking. I know each and every one of you were wanting to know how my weekend was, and it was great. And a lot of that has to do with the 4-0 start from the Indiana Hoosiers football program. And we'll get into that a little bit later with our man Mitchell Paige. A lot of good things, a lot of excitement heading into week 5 as the Maryland Terrapins come to town. And first of all, I know I've done this the past couple of Mondays, but thank you once again to everybody who tuned into the live post-game show with myself and Kyler Staley. We enjoy doing those, reacting moments after the Indiana games end, and we will continue to do those as often as possible. Not really sure on the current status on this Saturday's game, unfortunately. If you did catch this past weekend's show, or if you didn't, I'll go ahead and say it again. I will not be available to do post-game show this Saturday. I will be at what is probably my favorite time of the year, my favorite event of the year that I've gone to now for 4 straight years. I don't go to the whole weekend, but I go to the Louder Than Life Festival with my brother and some friends. And we're going Saturday, which is unfortunately the same day that Indiana takes on Maryland, of course. So I will not be available for a live post-game reaction. We may have Kyler and somebody else, or there is a chance that we'll record a post-game reaction on Sunday. It'll just be, be late and may or may not be live at that point. But I will update you all throughout the week, depending on what we decide to do with this weekend's postgame show. Nonetheless, big weekend coming up for Indiana football as they re-enter conference play against the Terps. Permanently, I should say, in the conference play. And also remember, don't want to forget, I've been trying to push for this, and so far the response has been very awesome, and I appreciate it. But please subscribe to our YouTube channel, Hoosier Illustrated, if you haven't done so already. And if you feel so inclined, hit that notifications bell, and you'll be notified anytime that we go live or post something new. And you'll be able to stay in touch with everything that we've got going on the website and the YouTube channel. Some of you probably just clicked off of the video after I made that horrible pun. Going to speak with Mitchell Paige, as I mentioned, a great conversation about the 4-0 start for the Hoosiers and really the road ahead for this Indiana football team. And looking back, I guess, real quick at all of the hype going into the season, we knew that Indiana football could be where they are at right now, which is a 4-0 start. I just think the biggest surprise so far is it's not that they're 4-0. It's the fact that they've been completely dominant in every single game that they've played in so far. 31-7 against FIU, 77-3 against Western Illinois, 42-13 against UCLA, and now 52-14 against Charlotte. You haven't allowed a team to score more than 2 touchdowns on you all season long. And not only that, but you've set a record, and I say you as in the Indiana football program has set a record for most points in any 4-game stretch in the history of IU football. 202 points at that, by the way. And Mitchell and I will react to that stat again a little bit later, but just the fact that Indiana football looks different. And I do think there is part of each and every one of us, whether we are people who are believing in what's going on or those who are still doubting, I do think with all of us, there is kind of deep down inside, we realize that, okay, yes, all of these things are great, but we still, and I don't want to use the phrase we, because I know I'm not a part of the football team or the program. I'm just a talking head reacting to what I see. But we as fans know that Indiana football really hasn't done anything when it comes to who they've played against. Now, maybe UCLA is better than we thought. They gave LSU a run for their money. I mean, they gave LSU more of a challenge on the road than Indiana. Then they gave an Indiana a challenge, I should say, whenever Indiana traveled to UCLA. They were tied at halftime, 17-17 this weekend. So maybe UCLA is a little better than we thought, or maybe LSU is kind of more along the lines of where I'm thinking. I don't think LSU is very good. I think they're decent, good enough to compete in the SEC, but they've kind of, with Brian Kelly, I just think that ship's eventually going to go south. It kind of already is going south. It could be worse, but I don't think Brian Kelly is going to end up being the coach at LSU for many seasons to come, but we'll have to wait and see. But again, overall, big picture for this Indiana football program as they continue to move forward. What is the ceiling? What's the ceiling? I know we predicted at the beginning of the year on HoosierIllustrated.com, myself, Kyler, and Drew, when we did the Indiana football preview. Drew mentioned 7-5. Both Kyler and I mentioned 8-4. I think right now, where it stands, especially when you look at the ESPN FPI, and I honestly don't like relying on those metrics, but we've referenced them enough on this show now that I feel like I have to continue to kind of just use that as the standard for whatever reason. But the ESPN FPI predicts Indiana to be 11-1, which just seems outlandish when you think about that in any way, shape, and form. But when you look at who's left on the schedule, and after you've seen all of these teams in action now, outside of Ohio State, who isn't beatable for Indiana? And I know some of you are probably like, come on, it's Indiana. You know they can find a way to lose. And that's absolutely true. But let's look at it real quick. Maryland this week, that'll be a great test for Indiana because Maryland has given the Hoosiers trouble in the past. I know they moved on from Talia Tagovailoa. And Billy Edwards Jr. has done some good things with the Terps so far through his first few games. And I'll stop there with that game because I don't want to, there's a whole conversation with Mitchell Paige coming up about that specifically. So I'll just leave it at that. Maryland will be a good test for Indiana and will really be the next good barometer of what really where truly the ceiling is for Indiana. What happens this Saturday will be a good indicator of that. But moving on from there, Northwestern, that could be a sneaky, tough game just because of the environment. You don't want Indiana to get off to a slow start in a very unique stadium that is only temporary. And I do think there could be some trouble for Indiana there, but I ultimately don't think they should lose that game. And then you got Nebraska at home. And we've recently seen them against Illinois this past weekend, on Friday, I should say, where Illinois went into Nebraska Stadium, took them to overtime, and took care of business. And now Illinois has a big test this weekend, actually, with Penn State. That could be it's really good barometer for their season. But with that being said, I think Nebraska also remains to be, especially when you think of all of the emotions that will be tied up in that game, not because it's a rivalry, but because it's homecoming. At that point, you will already potentially be bowl eligible. And you may be undefeated, and Nebraska's already taken a loss. The expectation will be for you to win that game if you get there unblemished. Then you have Washington at home. I think both Nebraska and Washington, I think those games will be very similar in terms of the caliber of opponent. Michigan State on the road. For some reason, I feel like, at least at the current state, if Indiana is unbeaten going into Michigan State, I feel like that's going to be one that Indiana lets get away from them. And I don't know exactly why. I just don't see Indiana marching through the entire schedule and not finding a way to mess up, if that makes sense. This team isn't going to be perfect. I mean, I know they look near perfect right now. And, we saw them get challenged against Charlotte. But I do think when they go on the road at Michigan State, if they're still unbeaten at that point, I smell trouble there. And again, we'll see how things go when we get to that point. But for some reason, at the moment, that game does not give me positive vibes. But then you have Michigan after that at home. And right now, I think that could be, especially if you're coming off of a loss to Michigan State, I could see that being Indiana kind of getting things back on track and finding a way to win at home against Michigan. Then on the road at Ohio State, we'll chalk that up as a loss. really not much else to say. Ohio State may be the best of the best in the Big Ten outside of Oregon, which Indiana does not play. And then you have Purdue at home, the bucket game. And Purdue I think Purdue is currently the worst team in the Big Ten. I thought it might have been UCLA a couple of weeks ago, but I think it's Purdue. You got throttled by Notre Dame. You lost to Oregon State on the road pretty handily. And yeah, that's kind of where I see. So I guess if the John prediction, the predictor scale, which isn't the FPI, works, then that still gets them going 10-2 with an unfortunate slip up at Michigan State in the spittoon game, and then a loss to Ohio State. But we'll see. That's just kind of where I currently project things going. But again, going back to before we even started this, Kyler and I mentioned 8-4, and Drew mentioned 7-5. The fact that I'm even saying 10-2 right now is a realistic possibility. It feels like we shouldn't be going down that route, but you know what? I just did. So let's move forward. We have some Indiana basketball, some recruiting news. I don't know if news is the right word. I guess it is news, but there's been a couple of predictions out there that Trent Sisley is leaning towards committing to Indiana, or will commit to Indiana, so to speak. And there's been a couple, I guess, Crystal Ball, depending on who you look at. Crystal Ball's 24/7. I know they're not affiliated with us, but I do know that someone on the 24/7 side has predicted Trent Sisley to land in Indiana. Trilly Donovan posted a couple of tweets this morning on Twitter. One of them being a leprechaun, or I think it was Lee Corso dressed as a Notre Dame leprechaun. And many Indiana fans looked into that thinking, this is going to be not good for the Hoosiers. When I think it may end up being more of a projection for a different player to commit to Notre Dame, not somebody that is also in the IU camp. But following that tweet, he posted a GIF of an Indiana player, wasn't a specific player, but it was an Indiana basketball player with the jacket on, whatever you want to call it, the warm-up shirt. And I think many of the speculation is in reference once again to Trent Sisley. And I don't know exactly when he's supposed to commit. Everything that I've just heard or seen is leaning toward Trent Sisley to Indiana at some point in the near future. So the first domino may indeed be falling for Indiana basketball and their 2025 recruiting class as things dip into fall. And I haven't even mentioned this. Some of you are probably like, wow, John, you got this far into the episode and you haven't even mentioned that it's fall yet. All you've been talking about the last few weeks is how close we are to fall. Well, you know what? Here's my opportunity. It's freaking fall now. And I'm excited. Bring the temperatures down. Say goodbye to summer. I'm ready to turn off my air conditioner. It's not off right now, and it probably will be a few more weeks before we get to that point. Probably mid-October, maybe even late October, before I have to worry about turning off the air conditioner. But we'll just leave it at that. So yeah, big Indiana basketball news. I guess that's what we're calling it now. It's Indiana basketball news. And maybe that's the first of a few different dominoes to fall when it comes to the recruiting class. And we've mentioned before, we probably expect 2 to 3 freshmen coming in. And I know Jalen Harrelson, we've talked about him canceling his visits. I don't necessarily know when that commitment is supposed to come. Then same with Braylon Mullins. And if you land all 3 of those guys, Indiana basketball is in business for the 2025 recruiting class. You can probably, at that point, put a bow on it and say, you know what, that's it. The rest of the guys can come from the transfer portal once the offseason hits. So there's your little Indiana basketball recruiting update. And if anything breaks over the next few days, either myself, Kyler, Drew, one of us, Alec, we'll be sure to report on that as quickly as we're able to. So I guess with that being said, let's go ahead and bring in Mitchell Paige for our weekly chat about Indiana football and really what's to come after this wonderful 4-0 start. So without further ado, Mitchell Paige.
All right, Mitchell Paige, how we doing? Happy Monday once again to you, my friend.
A 4-0 Monday, that is.
It is a 4-0 Monday. The first 4-0 Monday since 2020, the first 4-0 Monday with a brand new head coach ever, which I cannot believe that in the entire history of Indiana football, that not a single head coach has started their tenure with 4 straight wins.
Well, it's a tough stat for sure. That was a lot of stuttering I just did. A tough stat, but you think about what happens most of the time when you get a new coach. The program was probably in a bit of a state of disarray, and before the transfer portal, when a coach left, it was detrimental to recruiting. Maybe keep half the class, so you're losing a lot of talent, and you're inheriting a team that isn't very good. And with Indiana, they've lost more games than anybody in history. So it's a stat that makes sense and isn't, when you dive a little deeper, it isn't as bad. I bet there's other schools that have that same stat just because it's very few and far between, especially in the last 20, 25 years, that a coach leaves on good terms with the university.
Yeah, and that makes sense because it feels like 99% of the time at Indiana, the coach is leaving on bad terms, and you're starting
just
from
went
scratch.
1-11. Exactly.
Yeah.
So they have a 1-11 roster and now a brand new head coach that's got to instill new mindset and techniques and playbook. Usually going to go bad. Now, Signetti, who knows, even before the transfer portal, seems like this is just what he does. But another absolute clinic, demolition of a Charlotte team that I thought had some athletes, just punched in the face repeatedly by Indiana, felt like.
And not only did Signetti get the 4-0 start, but the announcers repeatedly mentioned that this is the most points ever scored in any 4-game stretch for the entire history, I should say, of the Indiana football program. I think are they at 202 total points for 4 games? It's 200 and something.
202. And for reference, I think I've talked about it a little bit. I'm also a University of Miami fan. That's who I grew up cheering for. And they made it seem like, oh my gosh, it's the most points ever. But Miami, to start the year this year, has scored 207, and that's the most points for them ever in a 4-game stretch. So 202 is not something to scoff at. It's not like, woe is Indiana, they have such bad stats. It's not like the 4-0 stat. This is unprecedented scoring. They're averaging almost 50 a game, if not 50 a game. Well, yeah, 50 a game, 50.5. I mean, that is an unbelievable statistic, something you don't see. I mean, this is a clinical Indiana football team that we're watching. I don't care who you play. You still have to go out there and demolish teams, and that's all they've done.
And again, you've played for some prolific offenses. Specifically, you were a part of them yourself. What do you feel like is the biggest difference between the offense that is a part of this Indiana team versus when you were playing with Kevin Wilson?
That's a great question, and something I've been thinking a lot about, because I take a lot of pride in how good we were on offense and our ability to strike at any moment on any team. Didn't matter who they were. Ohio State could get it just as much as Purdue. Like, we could strike at any time. And I think the biggest difference is it always feels like these guys are on schedule. They're rarely, sometimes I guess they get a big play if it's a run after catch, but they're not throwing it 50 yards in the air. It feels like when they throw the ball, they get 12 yards, 14 yards, 8 yards, but they're very rarely going backwards. It just feels so efficient. I think a lot of times with the teams that I was on, it was either big bang or 3 and out. And we'd score in a minute or punt, like, immediately. So it doesn't feel like this. It feels like they're going to score on every drive. And I'd be curious how many drives end in points versus don't over the course of the season. I think they scored on every possession.
I know Taven Jackson, I think on his first or second
they
possession.
may have had one punt.
They did.
So let's say with the starting quarterback in, if there's some stats guru out there, can go through the first 4 games and with the starting quarterback on the field, how many times the offense scores a touchdown. And I'm pretty sure there's or not even a touchdown, let's say ends in points. I'm pretty sure it's 1 or 2 possessions that do not end in points.
I think you're close to being right, if not dead on the money, because and I wonder how James Evans feels, because he's been on this Indiana roster for a long time now, and he's
been really effective. He's an all-conference punter.
Yes.
And he's thinking, this sucks that we lose a lot, but I'm going to get paid because I've been able to showcase how talented I am. And I mean, he doesn't have to tie his cleats, feels like.
Yeah.
And
the one thing that remains to be seen.
Room.
Oh, go ahead.
He could leave his pads in the locker room and no one would be none the wiser. It'd be amazing.
Yeah. The one thing that remains to be seen, and again, you can only play who's on your schedule, of course. I'm not trying to go down the route of who's Indiana played, which, of course, they have not had the toughest of schedules, and that's totally fine. Indiana's not used to having a schedule that is as favorable whenever you look at what they've had in the past. But I guess the one thing when we're talking about the offenses and the efficiency and that type of stuff, we'll really get a feel as the season progresses, now that we're fully going into Big Ten play from here on out, on if this type of efficiency will continue to, I guess, just stay the way that it is. And there's going to be some drop off. Indiana's not going to run through this entire schedule, even if they find ways to win in each of these games. The one thing that will be the most fascinating, though, is just how they're able to continue to have games where they're staying on schedule against opponents like Nebraska that are a few weeks away. Even Maryland this upcoming week. I don't know if you've looked at the FPI recently, Mitchell, and I know you've looked at it before, where they were projected to win, I think now it's 11 of 12 games.
11.
But the second most likely in terms of percentage of them to lose is actually this upcoming weekend against Maryland. That could have changed since I last looked, but it was either them or Michigan that were the second most, because again, the only loss that's projected
really
on
close.
The FPI is Ohio State.
I looked at it today. Ohio State is still like 13% chance for Indiana to win. But Michigan, Indiana percentage is like 60, maybe on the dot.
Yeah, I remember seeing that.
There's a chance.
I think Maryland's like 63, 64, something
They're
like
really,
that.
really close. Everything else is like 70+% Indiana to win. Maryland just always, for whatever reason, I think Loxley's a great coach. They can spread you out. They just are a kind of funky team to play that it's just a hard game you just got to get by it, right? Get through it. They have a bunch of athletes. They recruit the Northeast really well, and they just have really good players that sometimes can't put it all together. And it helps a lot that Tua Tagovailoa is, or not Tua Tagovailoa, whatever, his older brother, whatever. But you look at now this new guy who I know nothing
Billy
about.
Edwards Jr. He has a very non-Northeastern name.
Who knows what you follow and what you trust, but everything that I see in terms of his ranking, his grade week to week is about as good as Curtis Rourke. And anytime you have a quarterback, everything churns a lot easier. I mean, just look at Indiana. When you have a guy that's as efficient and as poised and confident as Curtis Rourke, everything becomes easier. And now all of a sudden they look like a freight train that you better get out of the way. A quarterback gets on a roll like that, same thing can happen in Indiana. I think, at least in the very beginning of the game, Hoosiers got exposed a little bit. Gave some plays up.
Defense was, I don't want to go as far as to say it was atrocious, but there was a point in the second quarter where I felt like Charlotte could just do whatever the hell they wanted to when they were running the ball.
And that's what happened. So you get a little on your heels. And that's all that happened. Indiana was still really good on defense, just like they have been the entire year. I love Twitter, as you know, and the freak out on Twitter was, oh my God, we're the worst defense. Like, relax. We gave up 2 touchdowns. They are on scholarship too. They have coaches that are scheming all week to try to score touchdowns. They had some things work, and it's a game of momentum, right? You get a little on the ball, a little pace to your offense. Everything seems to be happening easy, and now the defense is on their heels. Probably got a lot of base coverage because once you get that first initial good play, now you're on the ball quicker. Defense doesn't have time to make adjustments. So you're getting a lot of base defense. And the way Indiana plays, a lot of their coverages are disguised, right? They're hiding a lot of different things. They don't bring a bunch of pressures from all over the place, but everything it's not what you see, right? As a quarterback, he's a little tricked when Indiana can get set, but when you get 1 good play, 2 good plays, 3 good plays, defense gets on its heels. I don't care who it is. Like I said, we did it to Michigan. We did it to Ohio State. There's first-round draft picks on the other side of the ball on those teams. And when we get on schedule, it's really hard for a defense because the offense knows where they're going, right? So we can call our play in 1 second, get back on the ball, run the next one. Defense can't do that. They're trying to make adjustments. So yeah, you give up some big plays, you give up some pops. They are on scholarship. It's a Division I program that's in the American Conference. This isn't somebody that
Which
plays.
I didn't realize. I didn't realize they were in that good of a league. The American,
Yes.
in my opinion, maybe outside of the
Fifth
Mountain
league.
West, is probably the second best G5 conference there is out there.
Agree. It's a really solid league. They're going to play some really good teams throughout the year. They have good players. They're in Charlotte, which is a hotbed of talent. Some guys maybe you've never heard of. Indiana, a lot of guys you had never heard of. So there's skill on that side of the ball. They are going to make plays. Indiana played phenomenal on both sides of the ball in all phases, just like they have. And it was a complete demolition. Once again, Indiana never in doubt. The game, even when they were on schedule on offense, it still didn't feel like there was a chance in the world that Indiana was going to lose that game. It felt like a matter of time before the freight train came into the station, right? Like you better get out of the way with what you can because we're coming. And it's just felt like that all 4 games.
I think that may be the most difficult thing for certain aspects of the fan base to really grasp onto, is because you see the way things are going at that point in the first half, and you're like, okay, here comes the same old Indiana. That's
Yes.
the phrase that Indiana football fans love to cling on to. And I'm not going to act like I'm not a part of that, because you and I were texting back and forth, you and I and Dustin Schutte, and there was a point where I even said, like, this is looking like a Kevin Wilson defense whenever one team's just scoring after the other. And then thankfully, once you got to those last few minutes of the second quarter, we saw something that the team had not done yet, and that's close out the first half in a very positive way. And then by that point, at the beginning of the third quarter, you've buried Charlotte by scoring, I guess, 3 straight times at that point, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. And from there, it was never in doubt.
It was never in doubt. And I think you hit the nail on the head. The fan base has been groomed to, at first sign of trouble, panic for so long. So I'm not angry. When I got into a couple little Twitter fights, not even fights, but just like, calm down. We're going to be okay. Because to someone that has watched this for X insert number of years here, like even 2 years, it feels like when the train gets off the tracks, I keep using these train references.
That's a fair, I know it may seem like you're overusing it, but like that's the truth with some, right. Like there will be points where it seems like things are no longer on schedule the way that, at least to this point in the season, Indiana's never been off schedule. So It's weird to see them go off the rails at times.
Exactly. And I think that's what I was trying to convey. Like, hey, this is still Division I football. Winning is still hard. We've given up 2 touchdowns. Let's put this into perspective. If we give up 2 touchdowns every game, we're going to be 12-0. Like, giving up 21 points a game is really good defense. And I don't think, has Indiana even come close to giving up 21 points yet?
No, 14 is their highest.
Yeah. And it's never felt like
defensive. Yeah.
It never felt like 21 was even a possibility. So I understand the panic and the ingrained fear that Indiana fans have that all of this happiness has to come crashing down. And I'm with you. Hoosier fans, I stand with you. I feel it too. But you have to it just doesn't feel, when it's time to bow up, they have. And that's all we've seen from this edition of the Indiana Hoosiers. When it's time to make a play, they have guys that make the play over and over and over again. And I'm a believer. I'm going to give them benefit of the doubt until really the wheels have fallen off. Not just started to get shaky, fallen off. They just have too much talent, and I think they're really well coached, and I think that's the difference. This coaching staff puts players, quarterback to kicker, in places to succeed. It's been really, really cool to watch guys just excel by being in the right place. And that's coaching, that's listening to coaches. They're just extremely disciplined, and you're not used to seeing that as an Indiana fan. And now we're starting to get to the meat of the schedule. I can't wait for Saturday.
Yeah. I think there'll be plenty of nerves. And you mentioned Maryland's quarterback, Billy Edwards Jr., very similar to Curtis Rourke. Really the biggest glaring difference between the two so far this season. Curtis Rourke has not thrown a pick yet. Edwards Jr. has 2 picks. I don't know which games or game, whatever. I don't know which one that came in. Could have been against Michigan State, their only loss on the year. But it'll be for sure. I don't want to say I'm expecting a shootout because, again, maybe the Indiana defense prevails. I don't even know if there's a spread yet on this game at the time of this recording. There may be later on. But if you were predicting the spread, unless you know it, Mitchell, what would you set it at? Because here's what I would put it at. I think it will be, I'm thinking 6.5 Indiana, maybe 7.5.
I don't think Vegas quite believes in Indiana yet.
And I'm with you. That's why I'm thinking it realistically could be more than that.
7.5 was in my head. I bet Indiana all the way up to probably 13.5.
Yeah. We'll just have to wait and see at that point, but everyone's excited. It seems like I'd love to see a full crowd at Memorial Stadium for the first time this year, this Saturday. It's another noon kick. So
yeah. I feel like we should talk about the crowd again. Anytime there's a noon kick, especially for an opponent like Charlotte, it's going to take some time for people to trickle in. But at least what it looked like on TV, I was not able to go this week. It looked like it filled up and people stayed. So I think that fans are hearing the message. Now that we're into Big Ten season, most likely there's not going to be a 5-touchdown difference between Indiana and their opponent in a lot of these games, maybe some, but in a lot of them, now is when you start to really make an impact as a fan. So I'm guessing it's a noon kick, maybe 75% capacity at kickoff. I'm guessing 90, 95, maybe 100% capacity by halfway through the first quarter. And I think it's going to be a great game. Hopefully get some great weather and people stick around because this is a team. I texted my mom. You'll like this. You'll think this is funny. I texted her, this is no joking. This was 100% serious that I think I have to go to every game for the rest of the season because this just feels like magic. It feels magical.
I do love that.
Some things in life, you can just sense it. Think the stars align and you want to talk about setting yourself up for sadness. I have done it. I'm here. I am all the way in. There's just something about the team that if you aren't in the stadium, if you aren't paying attention, it just feels like you're missing out. So Indiana fans, if you'll be there, shoot me a tweet. We'll love to meet up with some folks.
And Indiana's doing a special for, I don't know how much longer it's going on. I saw this posted on Twitter, I believe, nearly right after the Charlotte game. Maybe by the time of this being posted, I'm not sure if it'll still be available, but there are $30 tickets for a certain period of time, I believe for any seat. I don't know that for a fact. Don't quote me on that, but there is a cheaper, there are discounted tickets available for the Indiana Maryland game this Saturday up until a certain time. I believe it might've been 48 hours from whenever they initially started it. So it could be close to being over at this point. But if you check it out, maybe you can get some cheaper tickets if you're wanting to go to the game this Saturday.
Get to the game. I will see you there. I'm going to be the guy with his chest painted.
You're gonna paint your chest?
Absolutely not. This is way too much blubber going on these days, John.
Any closing thoughts before we reconvene next week?
No. Excited for next week, man. It's going to be a shootout. Hopefully just Indiana doing all the shooting. But
I tell you what, this will be, again, so the one thing we didn't hit on real quick, and I'll be brief here. Indiana not in the top 25. Did you think they deserve to be in the top 25 this week?
Do they deserve it? Probably. Did I expect them to be? No, and that's because of 126 FBS teams. They probably started at 125 in voters' minds. So when you start from way behind, it's sometimes hard to catch up, but they're doing everything they need to do, taking care of business, and now just 2 slots technically outside the top 25. All they should be focusing on, and I don't have any doubt that Signetti has not and will not bring it up once, is taking care of business on Saturday, and then the next Saturday, and then the next Saturday, and the rankings take care of themselves. They did get another person to pick them for the college football playoff, though. So
who is that? So I know they had
it was just the same guy, Bill Connolly.
Oh, okay. Did he move him up, or is he still ranked 11?
Still right at 11, but
okay,
that's one more vote than Michigan got. So
that's true. we'll go ahead and wrap this thing up. Mitchell, appreciate you as always, and we'll do this again next week.
Absolutely. Go Hoosiers.
A big thanks to Mitchell Paige, as always, for taking the time out of his day to join us here on In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. All right, we mentioned a little bit about Indiana getting snubbed from the AP and coaches polls in the top 25. And I will say last week, I might have mentioned this on the post-game show, the post-game wrap-up show. I didn't think Indiana would be in the top 25 until after they beat Maryland this weekend, if they're able to do so. But at the same time, I was kind of convincing myself on Sunday that Indiana might find themselves in the top 25 just because you had a couple drop out like Nebraska, as well as maybe even a few others. I don't know exactly who is in the top 25. Obviously, I think of Nebraska because of them being affiliated with the Big Ten. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the top 25 before we move into some scores. But six Big Ten teams currently in the new poll. Illinois at number 19. And by the way, I'm only referencing the AP poll. I know earlier I was talking Indiana getting snubbed from both the AP and the coaches. I do typically rely on the AP more so than the coaches. And really, ultimately, when it comes to the college football playoff rankings, when those come out, both of these polls become essentially useless at that point. But until then, I tend to lean more towards what the coach or the AP poll says. So even if Indiana was in the coaches poll, that'd be great, but it still doesn't mean as much as being in the AP poll. And they're both 2 spots outside at 27 if you were ranking it past 25. But sticking with the AP poll, 6 Big Ten teams currently in it. Undefeated Illinois at number 19. You've got USC at 13, Michigan at 12, Penn State at 9, Oregon at 8, and of course, Ohio State at the top of at least the Big Ten rankings. They are number 3 overall. And then outside of Indiana receiving votes, you've got Nebraska with 25. They dropped out after they lost to Illinois. And then Iowa a few spots back with 24 votes. And I want to mention this. I think I may have even mentioned it last week. But why is Texas A&M ranked? They're number 24. They dropped out after their loss to Notre Dame. But then they came back in after beating McNeese 52-10, Florida on the road at 33-20, and Bowling Green 26-20 this past week, and helps them move up a spot. Florida's not good. Florida is going to end up firing Billy Napier before the season is over. But they're just getting the credit for that win because, one, they're an SEC team, Texas A&M, and them beating an SEC team for some reason in their magical world of the SEC being the best college football conference, which it is, but I don't think it's eons above everybody else the way that the SEC pundits seem to make it seem like. An SEC win simply because a team is in the SEC shouldn't count for more than it should because they're an SEC brand, because Florida's not good. And then Bowling Green. And for those who may be familiar with Bowling Green, Kentucky, that's not where this Bowling Green is. It's Bowling Green, Ohio. It's technically Bowling Green State University. Excuse me. Bowling Green Falcons. Team that Penn State struggled with. Well, Bowling Green struggles Texas A&M struggles even more so with them, only beating them by 6 points, and they move up in the poll. Maybe Bowling Green's good for the MAC, but that still shouldn't matter. Bowling Green is 1-2, and both of their losses, of course, to Penn State and Texas A&M. They beat Fordham 41-17. So they are playing a tough schedule outside of that FCS opponent to kick off their season. But either way, I know I'm not the only one that's just very annoyed with the SEC bias in college football in general. Let's look at the rest of the top 25 real quick. How many of the top 25 teams are from the SEC? Texas, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Ole Miss. That's 5 of your top 6. Then you got to go down to Missouri for your 16, the number 11. LSU, number 14. Let's see, what else? Oklahoma, number 21. And then Texas A&M at number 24. I don't think I'm missing anybody there. But 9 of your top 25 teams from the SEC should probably be 8 because Texas A&M hasn't done enough in my opinion, to find their way back in the top 25. But again, they're going to get that SEC bump. And I'll say this right now. If Indiana at 4-0, I don't care who they played. If Indiana had an SEC logo on their jersey instead of a Big Ten, they'd be in the top 25 right now. And that's 100% the truth. So I'll move on from that. And I want to go over some of the results from the weekend that stood out. Again, as I refuel after getting a little worked up over some top 25 nonsense. I will say that before I get into these games, my parlay did not hit this weekend, unfortunately. Last week we went 3-0 with the parlay, and thankfully the separate bet that I made last week with Kentucky and Georgia was not part of that parlay. Well, this week was kind of the opposite. I was 0-3 on the parlay, and I did not make a separate bet for Indiana to cover against Charlotte, unfortunately, which I mentioned I might do. And that ended up being the one thing that would have hit. Everything else, I took the under in Minnesota and Iowa. That did not hit. Penn State ended up covering the 49-point spread against Kent State, which I thought was going to be impossible for them to do. And then what was the last leg? Oh, it was Oklahoma State money line against Utah, and they ended up losing by 3. So none of them were really bad beats, unfortunately, or I guess fortunately. Bad beats are, worse in general. But anyway, anytime you miss a parlay, it's okay. But we'll bounce back hopefully this week and later on, probably on Friday per usual. I'll let you know what I'm riding with this week. And hopefully, if you're tailing me on any of these picks, we can get back on the right track. So let's look at the Big Ten, some of the results from this past weekend. Already mentioned the Illinois versus Nebraska game that went to overtime. I don't know if any of you watched that game, but that was one of the better college football games that I really have gotten to see so far this year. If it really, and this might sound cheesy, it felt like you were watching an NFL game. And I'm not necessarily talking about the product on the field, which there were flashes. I mean, a lot of Dylan Raiola is already getting comparisons to Patrick Mahomes from Nebraska. And so, and I'm sure, honestly, some of that I'm sure is annoying to some people. And it doesn't bother me as much. I'm sure it will bother me the longer he's in college football because he's only a freshman. But because we know unless he transfers out of Nebraska, he's going to be there for 3 years. And they're going to be talking about how he's this new Patrick Mahomes style quarterback up until he gets to the NFL. But great product between them, Nebraska and Illinois. Luke Altmaier did great as well for the Fighting Illini, and Illinois just able to, I guess, take care of business, pull off the upset. And Nebraska, apparently, I wish I had the stat in front of me. They have not scored in an overtime frame in, I think, since 2015. I don't have that stat right in front of me, but they were talking about it a bunch during that game. And I'm not, and again, I said that scored, not even just winning an overtime game. They have not scored in an overtime game in nearly 10 years, according to my brain calculations, if I'm remembering correctly. Feel free to correct me in the comment section if I'm wrong on that. But Nebraska, a lot of Nebraska fans were kind of just, they were chanting same old Nebraska, kind of like Indiana fans like to do from time to time when things aren't going their way. I think Nebraska will be fine. They may not be as good as they thought they were after losing a game like that, but I think Illinois might be pretty good. Excuse me. Just jumped over my words a little bit. But I might even take Illinois money line this weekend at Penn State. And some might think that's a crazy thing to do considering you're going on the road. I believe it's going to be a night game, and it might even be their whiteout game from the Nittany Lions. So maybe that's not. I mean, Illinois has gone in and won at Penn State recently, so it's not out of the question. Even though maybe Penn State may be better, I think that score against Kent State says more about Kent State than it does Penn State, because we've already seen Penn State struggle against Bowling Green a couple of weeks ago. And I think Illinois is pretty good, but we'll see. Another team actually both of those teams, Indiana avoiding on their schedule for 2024. Moving on, though, Ohio State took care of business with Marshall, and it was a lot closer early on than many expected to be. Very similar to the way Indiana-Charlotte played out, but Ohio State gets their cupcakes out of the way, and they'll be playing some real competition from here on out. I already mentioned Kent State or Penn State versus Kent State. Man, that's not a word jumble, but like saying Penn and Kent, you could say Pent and Ken if you're not watching it. So, but yeah, they take care of business 56-0, and they'll take on Illinois this upcoming weekend. Probably what many saw as the game of the week, at least in the Big Ten, Michigan finding a way to beat USC 27-24 with massive quarterback woes. So Michigan, if you didn't know this, Michigan set a record for the lowest passing yards in a game since 1987. And so I believe, Alex Orji made his debut. He was 7 for 12 for 32 yards, no touchdowns, no interceptions, and they were able to just do it on the ground. They had 290 rushing yards. Khalil Mullings and Donovan Edwards both getting it done with 3 touchdowns total. And I guess, is Michigan going to be relying on the run? Are they going to be turning the clock back a few decades and trying to run the table that way? Who knows? But this Michigan team, they're a puzzle right now because they didn't look like they belonged on the same field as Texas a couple of weeks ago. And now you face a USC team that beat LSU in the opening weekend, and you were not favored in this game, by the way. And Michigan finds a way to get it done in a very non-traditional way, or maybe some would say it's more traditional, at least in the old school fashion. So yeah, Michigan back on the right track and, marching towards their Big Ten title defense potentially. I'm not predicting that. I still think Sharon Moore is, and I'll stop saying he's a bum, at least for now. But I do think Michigan is still very beatable by most teams from the Big Ten potentially. We'll move on. I talked a little earlier about LSU and UCLA, how that ended up being a lot closer than it probably should have been. It was tied 17-17 at halftime, but that was all she wrote for UCLA. After that, LSU ended up winning that one 34-17. But of course, it's in Indiana's best interest if UCLA looks better moving forward. Obviously, talked a ton about Indiana, Charlotte. Maryland, Indiana's next opponent, defeated FCS Villanova 38-20. And I do think next week's battle between the Hoosiers and the Terps will be a quarterback battle of sorts. If Indiana is able to find a way to shut down Billy Edwards Jr., as I mentioned earlier, really the biggest difference between Curtis Rourke and Billy Edwards Jr. through this amount of games so far is the fact that Edwards has found a way to throw 2 interceptions and Rourke has not. Now, granted, Maryland's already played. Well, I was going to say they played a conference schedule or a conference opponent, but so is Indiana. I guess it's hard to wrap my mind around that since UCLA is not a traditional Big Ten team as the way that Michigan State was for Maryland. So I guess what's the key here? Is it turnovers? We'll have to wait and see. If Indiana's defense can stop Maryland, and by the way, the early spread on this, at least earlier, I know I mentioned during my segment with Mitchell, I didn't know what the spread was, but I believe right now it's set at, excuse me, Indiana -7, which is right around where we were talking about. So I think that's very reasonable. And if Indiana can find a way to take care of that, and I mean, I think they can win by more. I'm not ready to say they're going to do that just yet. Maybe they will, but we'll see. So let's move forward. Rutgers on the road at Virginia Tech. They won that game 26-23. A lot of outsiders still see Rutgers as kind of the low lives of the Big Ten. I do think Rutgers is a lot better than they usually are. I think they're going to be a middle of the pack Rutgers or Big Ten team, I should say. And they'll probably turn some heads with a few surprising wins this year. And going on the road at Virginia Tech, even if it is a subpar Virginia Tech team, that is no easy thing to do. So moving on, got a few more. Excuse me. Washington got back on the right track by defeating Northwestern 24-5 as Northwestern made their Big Ten debut, or I should say West Coast Big Ten debut, as they traveled out to the West Coast to take on the Huskies, national runner-up from last year. Totally different team, obviously, but still worth noting they are the national runner-up. Only got 5 points, though. A safety and a field goal in the second and third quarter. And Northwestern, I think if we're predicting the bottom 3 of the Big Ten, I think the order can be interchanged, but I think the 3 lowliest of the low for now are worst being Purdue, then UCLA, then Northwestern. I'm starting to lean more toward UCLA, maybe being a little better than Northwestern. We'll have to wait and see what ends up happening over the next couple of weeks. But yeah, Washington takes care of business there, gets back on the right foot after their loss to the Washington State Cougars. And then the aforementioned game, man, I hate whenever my throat tries to give out on me. It really frustrates me, especially when I can't stop myself and turn my cough button on, I guess, for a couple of seconds. But yeah, Iowa, Minnesota in the battle for the Floyd of Rosedale. Iowa takes care of business there, 31-14 on the road, easily beating the over under, which was, I think I had it at 36.5. Ended up the total being 45. So yeah, good win for the Iowa Hawkeyes as they appear to be finding some offensive life, especially when that was kind of billed as 2 defensive teams taking on each other. Minnesota coming off back-to-back shutouts and also holding North Carolina to a measly 19 points, even though they lost that game. And speaking of which, guys, I don't know if you saw that North Carolina James Madison score, but it was 70-50. James Madison won, but that is a basketball score through and through. And I don't get how you allow that many points in a football game at that level. Like if you're North Carolina, allowing anybody to score 70 on you. Even if the role was reversed and North Carolina won 70-50, that's absolutely insane. Just want to throw that out there, though, while I was talking North Carolina. So, yeah, Iowa wins the Floyd of Rosedale. They're 3-1, want to know the Big Ten. And I got a couple more to look at real quick. Boston College able to beat Michigan State 23-19. That game was fairly close towards the end. Michigan State getting their first loss on the year, beating or losing to the Eagles 23-19. And Bill O'Brien's got Boston College kind of doing pretty well. I mean, I know that Florida State win might not mean as much. Florida State ended up bouncing back this weekend, by the way, defeating, who was it? California, Cal, from formerly of the Pac-12, now in the ACC with Florida State. But either way, still don't think Florida State is much to get excited about winning with against nowadays. So, yeah, Michigan State gets their first loss against Boston College on the road. Still think Michigan State is going to end up being a decent team in the conference, as I mentioned. Kind of worried about when Indiana will travel to East Lansing later on in the year. And then finally, lowly Purdue travels out west to Oregon State. The Beavers no longer in the Pac-12. I guess that they are technically. It's the Pac-2 unofficially. But they lose to Oregon State 38-21. Purdue does find a way to, at least be somewhat competitive in that game, especially late, scoring 2 touchdowns in the fourth quarter. But I think Purdue's the worst team in the conference. And I'm not saying that because they're the rival. I think they are that bad. And Ryan Walters was expected to, be a good replacement for Jeff Brom, being the former defensive coordinator at Illinois and not doing terrible with them in year 1 with Purdue. But things are not looking good right now in West Lafayette, and they have a very tough road ahead. I believe they've got Nebraska this week, and we'll have to wait and see what happens there. But unless my eyes have deceived me, I think Nebraska should take care of Purdue fairly easily, even though it is on the road in West Lafayette. So that does it for your Big Ten rundown from the weekend. I'm trying to see if there's any other notable results. Tennessee, I'll go and mention some of these top 25 matchups. Tennessee able to take care of Oklahoma on the road 25-15. I think Tennessee may end up being, final Tennessee again, if that makes sense. It's been a while since Tennessee's been a true contender for a national championship, and this may be the year for them to really compete for that. BYU took care of number 13 Kansas State 38-9. And the Brigham Young Cougars, man, the Mormons, the Fighting Mormons, they're getting it done. They're 4-0 to start their year. And I believe they hopped in the top 25 this week. I think they might be number 22, something along those lines. And So, yeah. Also, the team that defeated Notre Dame, Northern Illinois, they took a loss this past weekend to Buffalo, who was projected to be one of the worst teams in the Mid-American Conference. They beat Northern Illinois on the road at Northern Illinois, 23-20 in overtime, and that'll likely do it for Northern Illinois'. I mean, maybe they could, go 11-1 and be the best team in the MAC and find themselves in the college football playoff. But, when you lose to a team like Buffalo, that doesn't really do anything good for your chances moving forward. Oh, and I can't forget this. This wasn't a ranked game, but I would be mistaken to not even talk about this game. I didn't watch it, but I'm surely if you were paying attention to college football on Saturday night, you saw the wild finish that was in the Colorado versus Baylor game. And you all have heard me. I'm not the biggest fan of Colorado with Deion Sanders, but anytime you can pull off a win in the fashion in which they did, it's absolutely insane. So Colorado, with time waning down, they need a touchdown to send it to overtime. Shedeur Sanders throws the ball downfield, and his receiver, it goes in and out of his chest, right, on third down. And that, if he had caught that, he was just a few steps from the end zone. That would have been a touchdown for Colorado. So now you're on fourth down, and basically all you have left is time for a Hail Mary. And same exact thing happens. Shedeur Sanders finds a way to get the ball, throw it downfield, and finds his receiver in the end zone, kind of diving on the ball. And again, this is at Colorado. Crowd goes nuts, goes into overtime, and Colorado finds a way to get it done. And before the game officially ended, there was a very questionable, I guess I can't remember if it was a touchdown or a non-touchdown or a fumble recovery, something along those lines. But the students rushed the field before the game was officially over, and ended up being a win for Colorado after they were able to review the play. But the students had to re-rush the field, which is just kind of awkward. But and I have no problem with rushing the field, by the way. And I feel like when it comes to college basketball, there seems to be a lot more problems with it. I don't know if it's because of, there's more danger involved with it, just because it's a smaller space getting onto the court than it is the field. But I guess shout out Colorado finding a way to beat Baylor. I don't really know how good Baylor's supposed to be, but anytime you can win in the fashion in which they did when the odds are against you, that's a good thing. And I don't necessarily root for Colorado to succeed. And I'm sure I haven't listened to any of Deion Sanders' comments from after the game. I don't really care to hear them. But he's doing his best right now to try to keep this thing afloat at Colorado after kind of a rough start for the Buffaloes in the first few weeks. And this will definitely boost their egos if they weren't boosted already enough. So that'll do it for your rundown of everything that happened in college football this week. And I guess we got a couple more minutes, I'll look at a couple NFL scores as well. And I guess I'll start here. Colts finally found a way into the win column. And I'll say this. For those of you who are Colts fans, you won't be happy with this necessarily, but I took Bears money line this weekend, thinking that Caleb Williams was going to get it done on the road at Indianapolis. And Anthony Richardson, he's fine. And I know he didn't really have the best game. Really, this is more about Jonathan Taylor than anything else. But Caleb Williams, he did great for the Bears. 363 yards, 2 touchdowns. They still couldn't get a win. But Colts get it done. They find a way to get in the win column. And I've noticed this. A lot of NFL teams, you got to remember, they're all professional players. I think it's hard for me to wrap my mind around this because I'm always thinking collegiately, college football. But most of these NFL teams, when they've lost their first 2 games, they find a way to win that third one. So they're not fully derailing their season unless they're just horrible. Their teams are just kind of trying to tank almost. But heck, I thought that with the Panthers, and they find a way to beat the Raiders 36-22 yesterday. So, and then one other thing I wanted to, okay, here we go. Here's the current NFL unbeatens going into next week. And there is one unbeaten that still plays tonight for Monday Night Football with the Bills. I did include them in this, but they're technically not at the 3-0 rate like these other guys are so far. But the current unbeatens through 3 weeks: Vikings, Steelers, Seahawks, Chiefs, and then of course the Bills, as I mentioned earlier. I'd say the only one that is not surprising. I guess you can make the argument that none of these are surprising, but the only one that's truly not surprising is really the Chiefs being 2-0. They were able to get things done on the road, or 3. I don't know why I said 2-0, 3-0. They were able to get things done on the road last night against the Falcons, 22-17. And I'll tell you what, too, I know some of y'all don't care about fantasy football, but I'm getting addicted to it. I love watching my players really kind of just, I don't even really know how to describe it, really. It's just fun to see them get points and go up against whoever your opponent is for the week. And some of you have been doing fantasy football forever, like, John, I've been doing this. I know exactly what you're talking about. You're late to the party, my man. And you're right. It's 2024, and this is my first year doing fantasy football. And you know what? The fact that there's always going to be things in this world that you can do for the first time and get that feeling, that rush, if you call it. For me, that's fantasy football right now, and I'm enjoying that. So I think with that, we'll go ahead and wrap things up today here on a Monday. So appreciate you guys sticking with me as always, and we'll do it again on Wednesday once again. Don't know who we're going to have on the show this week, but surely it will be something good for you, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the week as we march toward week 5 in college football, and we get ever so closely to the beginning of college basketball season. Again, as I mentioned last week, under a month from Hoosier hysteria. So we'll keep you updated on all things Indiana, Hoosiers, Colts, Pacers not too long from now as well. So looking forward to all of that. So thank you for listening, watching, whatever it may be. Check out everything going on HoosierIllustrated.com. As always, with Kyler Staley, Alec Lasley, Drew Rosenberg, Dylan Traeger, amazing staff. I couldn't rave about how great it is to work with them enough. I'm not just schmoozing right now if they're listening. It truly is a great group of dudes to work with as we get rolling here in this college athletics season. So until Wednesday, and I'll go ahead and say this one more time. Subscribe on YouTube. I won't bug you any more about it other than that, at least today. But until next time, this has been another episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com.